All right, well, my clock says 12:01, so I'm going to kick us off, share a few things with folks, and then I'll pass it over to our presenters. But again, thank you all for joining us for our Best of Showcase series today. If you weren't aware, we've got lots of programs. This is our last one for this week, and then next week we launch a few more. So if you haven't registered for some of those, I encourage you to do so. They are all free, and with the exception of the one that is noted there, they will all be recorded. And so if you're not able to attend in real time, those recordings will be available in just about a week or so after the sessions take place. But lots of good content that has already happened this week, lots of good content coming to you today, and then we'll have some more sessions next week as well. And then, of course, I want to share some of our other opportunities that are coming up. We have our academic initiatives, business operations, and housing facilities conferences all running concurrently in person in Columbus, Ohio, early next month. And we just extended the regular registration rate for that. So that opportunity is still out there for folks. And then we'll round out our year with some other virtual options. The STARS College, which is for undergrads that are interested in student affairs and housing. Registration is open for that still. And our Multicultural Institute, which is a 2-day virtual event happening in October, and our Live-In Symposium happening in November. Both of those opportunities offer team passes. So if you're looking for something for your whole staff to participate in, there's an option there for a team registration. And then, of course, I also want to share, it is almost the end of 2023, which is shocking to me, but here we are. And so we are looking for folks that are interested in leadership opportunities in 2024. We have lots of opportunities available. There's some information on our website. If you're interested in one of those leadership positions, the applications are open through October 5th. But that website also has information on how to get involved and just join some of our committees or networks. Maybe you don't want a leadership position quite yet, but lots of opportunities for how you can get involved with us on our volunteer page. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. I will let them introduce themselves because there's a whole crew of them today, but I am happy to welcome the 2023 Wakuho Best of Program winners and their session today.
Thank you so much. We're super excited to be here. So welcome to our presentation today, where we're going to dive into a crucial topic that touches upon the well-being of our residential community and the efficiency of our operations. I'm delighted and excited to introduce our discussion on enhancing safety and efficiency for mold mitigation, developing a partnership between housing administration, residential education, and environmental health and safety at San Diego State University. My name is Cynthia Cervantes. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Office of Housing Administration. I have the pleasure of presenting today with 3 of my colleagues, and we'll turn to them for their introductions. We can get started with Malik, and Jake, if you can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Malik?
Hello, everyone. I'm Malik Ismail. I'm the Associate Director for Housing Facility Services at San Diego State University.
Thank you, Malik. Jake?
Hey all, my name is Jake Bell. I'm a residence hall coordinator here at San Diego State. I oversee Mile Mecca if you ever have a chance to visit campus, and I use pronouns he, him, ed.
Thank you, Jake. And Paul?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul DeSoto. I am the Industrial Hygiene Services and Occupational Safety Services Manager at the EH&S Department, Environmental Health and Safety at San Diego State University.
Wonderful. Thank you. So on the next slide is a breakdown of what we will be covering during our presentation. I'll provide institutional and departmental context. We will then transition to mold, understanding what it is and how we provide service, support, and education, not only to our students, but also their families. We will also walk through our mold assessment protocol and response and conclude on how you can get started or enhance your collaborative partnerships on campus to provide a similar program. So let me set the stage with a bit of context regarding our institution and our departments. San Diego State University is proud to be one of the 23 campuses within the California State University system. We are one of the larger campuses in this prestigious system with a thriving community of over 37,000 students. In fact, our housing program is the second largest within the entire system, showcasing our commitment to providing exceptional living experiences to our students. In alignment with both national trends and SDSU specific data, we've implemented a significant initiative, a 2-year live-on requirement, for students who come to us from outside of our immediate service area. This requirement is rooted in our dedication to bolstering student success by creating a supportive living and learning environment. Now, with this context in mind, let me share a little bit more about our department and students. We have over 8,400 students living with us on campus across 25 different residential building facilities. We are a bifurcated housing program. So the Office of Housing Administration sits on the Division of Business and Financial Affairs side, while our residential education office sits within the Division of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity. The program is supported by over 100 professional staff members. We have 23 learning communities, and we have 3 different room types across our properties, and that's going to be a mix of traditional residence halls, suite style communities, and apartments. We primarily serve first and second year students, but also have a good number of upper division students and graduates living with us. Now, with this context in mind, let's explore how we're further enhancing safety and efficiency mold mitigation within our program. What you see on this slide is our workflow for handling mold reports that begin once we receive a report submission, followed by an initial assessment, on-site inspection, transparent communication, a comprehensive mitigation plan if needed, implementation through follow-up inspections, meticulous documentation, preventative measures, and dedicated resident support. This systematic approach ensures swift and effective responses to make not only safety and comfort priority, but also education and support for our residents. And this also involves a collaborative effort across the multiple departments. So we're going to take a closer look at each step, and we'll begin with understanding mold. So I'm going to transition it to Paul.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. So before I get started on the actual mold assessment process here at San Diego State, I just wanted to talk a little bit about mold itself. So what do we know about mold? Mold is a type of fungus that causes the breaking down of natural materials. So right here, you see a perfect example of what mold is meant to do, right? Breaking down an old piece of fruit. Molds are found in virtually every environment and can be detected both indoors and outdoors. So this is something that, you know, when we do get to the education piece and communication with the students and the parents, we find that sometimes this might not be common knowledge. So this is something that we do need to communicate when we do get to that point. So mold spores are very tiny. So this is why many people don't understand that mold spores are essentially always present, both indoors and outdoors. They are 10 to 30 micrometers in diameter on average. For comparison, a single grain of beach sand is 1,000 micrometers. So what you see here is what the mold spores actually look like under a microscope. And you see the long section there, the hyphal fragment, and at the tips of the hyphal fragments are the actual mold spores themselves. And those are dispersed by either wind or vibration. Once those are released, they, you know, float through the air, land on a surface wherein there is sufficient conditions for growth to occur, then you start to see visible spotting. Next slide, please, Jake. All right, so what does mold need to grow? Well, like all living organisms, it needs food and water, right? In our living spaces, the most common or obvious would be like a water leak or plumbing or a flood. Some other situations where moisture can be introduced that are a little bit more common but less known would be elevated humidity. So this is something that we see quite often, actually. And many of your campuses might experience that as well, depending on where you're located in the country. So here in San Diego, we're pretty much kind of right on the coastline, right before the desert starts. We do commonly have a marine layer that rolls in the evenings and rolls back out. So humidity is a challenge that we do face. Anything over 60% relative humidity is sufficient enough to start producing mold, visible mold spotting. So photo here that you see on the right or left, excuse me, is essential oil diffuser. So sometimes our students can introduce humidity themselves within a living space, is what we're finding out as well. Condensation on surfaces such as windows, so that can occur. That's another great way to introduce moisture into a space. That can happen when the temperature is significantly different between the inside of a living space and the outside. We have also seen situations where the temperature has been significantly different between rooms. So the adjacent room can be, way cooler than the room that you're in. And we have had situations where micro condensation has formed on a wall, which can be hard to see if the wall is painted or it's textured. So food. So the perfect food source for mold to grow in a living space is dust and dirt. That is also something that we communicate during the education piece when we communicate with parents and students. So very common, moisture plus dust, that's all you need for mold spotting to start. Flowers and plants, that's another great way to introduce spores into a space. So mold spores are always present. You will never reduce it to zero, but introducing mold spores into a space obviously is something that we want to try to avoid. So drywall, wood, particle board, carpet, those are all kinds of building materials that when they do become wet, saturated by a leak or a flood, will start to develop mold spotting. And typically that can happen in as little as a day or two, if not dried out properly. Something else to keep in mind is that leather is also a food source. So we have had situations where we have observed mold spotting on leather. So leather bags, leather shoes, purses. If you do see spotting on leather, typically that's a good indication that you might be facing a humidity problem within a space. And that is something to look at if you walk into a living space and notice that it's, kind of muggy and damp. If you or a consultant is doing the assessment, I highly recommend looking at any kind of leather material in the room as well. So next slide, please, Jake. All right, so you'll hear me repeat that our goal here at SDSU is always open and honest communication. So throughout the whole process, the assessment process and follow-up, open, honest communication with the student is key. There are sometimes or some certain points where the conversation does become a little bit tricky. And one of those is the safety, right? And a lot of times the question is, am I safe? Am I being exposed? So unfortunately, there is no safe level for mold. Like we just talked about, mold spores are present everywhere, both indoor and outdoor. It's not regulated. OSHA doesn't have a permissible exposure limit. There's no, pass, fail, or safe, unsafe. So we just, like I said, try to minimize the amount of spores in a living space. That's always our goal. The other thing is, we get asked if the symptoms that a student may be experiencing is related to mold. So that is something for a medical professional to communicate with the parent and student about. So we're not, health professionals ourselves. And the tricky part with that is that everyone is affected differently. So short-term allergic reactions similar to pollen or animal allergies are the most common health effects for individuals that are sensitive to mold. So most of these symptoms are temporary and eliminated by controlling the mold growth within a space. Next slide, please. The other question we get asked often or sometimes what's mentioned is, black mold or black toxic mold. So what we know is that there are certain types of molds that have the potential to produce mycotoxins. To date, and this is from the CDC, there have been no confirmed cases of mold mycotoxins directly affecting or infecting a human. That has not been determined. But we do know that certain molds can produce mycotoxins. And what scientists believe, or what we, somewhat understand, is that the molds are essentially producing these mycotoxins to compete for the food, right? So a perfect example is this petri dish that you see. So there is a plate of agar, which is basically a food source. And it's believed that the mycotoxins are being produced by certain molds to kill off other molds and protect itself. So that's a great example right there. All right, next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Jake.
All right, so you may be looking at this and kind of wondering, how does this factor into like the residence life side of things? So first, just kind of looking at a resident or student support from a residential education perspective. One, we always want to make sure that they're allowing them to feel heard, so approaching with empathy. And I think a lot of that comes into our student leader training and education, which I'll talk about in later slides. But making sure that residents have that space to come and make sure that they're not feeling like turned away. Additionally, addressing next steps. So a lot of times students don't know where to start. They a lot of times will either go to their RA, their resident advisor, or go to like us as hall coordinators and kind of just like ask like, hey, could someone address this? And so it's kind of walking them through first what our service request process looks like, and then also just kind of walking them through what the maintenance staff follow-up looks like, both from the housing side and environmental health and safety side. So both just kind of like giving them that context of what those next steps look like, because a lot of times they haven't seen that yet. And then also having the resident advisor or pro staff follow up with the resident. So with that, after their room is checked out, and we'll talk a little bit more about the process later on. Once that's checked out by the maintenance staff, we'll kind of always follow up with the resident, just checking to see how they're doing, see if their issue has been addressed, and then do any follow-up that's needed. We also do crash course education, so we'll talk about education later section as well. But teaching residents on hygiene and best practices. And so a lot of this goes back to Paul just kind of mentioned about like mold is present everywhere. And so what are the things that they can do to kind of help avoid that? So one of our policies is actually that we don't allow humidifiers, and that's kind of best practices for avoiding introducing that extra humidity. Additionally, we equip them with need to know knowledge about mold. And so we'll go over that in the education piece later on as well. And then also allowing them to have the place to reference educational resources. So we have several digital resources that we allow them to access. We also go over this additionally in their move-in meetings and their building meetings as well. Just trying to give them some additional context, and not quite as in-depth as Paul went into, but just giving them those best practices and letting them know how they can try and help sustain their space moving forward. And so from a student leader side, one, there's the education. And so again, we collaborate with environmental health and safety to do student leader training. So integrating the basics of like mold education into that student leader training. We also go into a little bit more depth on mold causes. So the information that Paul ran through is the same thing that we share with our student leaders. And so we try and get that done, especially earlier on in training, just to give them that context. And then also ensuring student leaders are able to help residents with their service requests. So obviously, our service requests are the main way that we track how we're following up with our student leaders, as well as obviously internal processes. But that said, we want to make sure that student leaders know how to walk their residents through putting those in correctly. So then that way we can make sure that we're addressing things in a timely manner. And then as far as supporting student leaders goes, we want to make sure that student leaders have a space to be heard on their concerns as well, particularly if they see multiple residents that are claiming that there is like high level of mold in the space. We want to make sure that student leaders, sometimes that could be frustrating if residents are coming to them. And so walking through kind of how we are supporting our residents, that they don't necessarily feel that pressure. Additionally, we always try and connect them with the housing team to address concerns and better understand the process and reports of mold. And again, we'll go into this more in the education focused slides later on. With that, I'll pass to Malik to briefly talk about our student and parent support after that service request, and kind of walking through when we're going through that process.
Thank you, Jake. So a lot of times we are getting communication about a mold issue in a student's room. Sometimes it's not through the service request process. Sometimes it's through, we have a virtual desk that students and parents have access to. And then also sometimes we'll just get emails directly from parents with their concerns. And a lot of times the parents make assumptions about our physical environment and our structure of our building. For example, many times will tell us that there's mold in our ventilation, in the ventilation ducts, not realizing that our air conditioning units are isolated to each individual room. And so there is no ventilation ducts that run through the buildings. There's maybe about a 2-foot duct that goes from the fan coil to the register vent. A lot of technical stuff there. But what we do when we, talk to parents and students is, reviewing our protocols, sharing the general information, again, the same type of information that Paul shares with our student leaders. And then we give them that general information to help kind of settle their worries for the most part, and then to ensure that that they feel confidence in how we are going to be responding, and telling them what we can and what we can't do. And so, like, there was an example from a couple of years ago where the parents wanted the county of San Diego to come out and do an assessment, not realizing that we're a state institution and the county of San Diego has no oversight over what we do at the university. So we can explain that to them and explain that, we're bringing in our own environmental health and safety folks that are trained to both identify and then provide the direction on our remediation efforts. So we get that information via reports that after we do an assessment of a space with environmental health and safety, they're there looking for potential water sources, potential food sources. And if there are things that, we in San Diego State need to do to correct an issue, that'll be documented, and then we're required to do that follow-up. And then if there are things and instructions that we need to provide to the students about things that they may be doing in their room that are contributing to mold growth. A prime example of that we're experiencing right now with the high humidity in San Diego during the month of September is we're seeing students opening their windows and running their air conditioning at the same time. And they're bringing in that humid air from outside, and the air conditioning units are just not capable of keeping up with that demand. And so we start to see moisture forming, and that becomes a problem for mold growth, as we already explained. So we go over those reports with the parents and with students as well, so that they get a sense that we're here to resolve this issue. And we explain what San Diego's role is in that process, and then we explain what the student's role is in that process, and then help support that student. If there are situations where we have to do more thorough remediation, we can and have relocated students to other rooms while we remediate that issue. And then in addition to that, if it is something that requires immediate attention, and we need to move students and all of their belongings to a different space, we do have a contractor that the university has that will help us move those students. They'll provide moving supplies, boxes, tape, whatnot, and then we'll actually schedule to have moving crew come and relocate those students to a new space. And so that's something that we offer to parents and to students to help them understand that we are here to help your student get through whatever it is that they're dealing with in their room.
Yeah, so with that, I'll go back into a little bit on the education piece from the student leader side. So I mentioned this a little bit in terms of that we bring in environmental health and safety, discuss mold potential concerns, and then also the EHS process and response in mold reports. And so obviously the student leader side looks a little bit more in depth than what we would give residents. So with that, as I mentioned, we go through the slides that Paul mentioned, but we also go a little bit into what the process looks like on the back end as well, just so the student leaders have that context. And then that way, if residents ask, they can always ask them to follow up with housing, but do have like a general idea of how we're addressing those. Additionally, we ensure student leaders are trained on emotionally intelligent responding with empathy. This is something that we incorporate, not necessarily in relation to mold specifically, but we incorporate it in multiple aspects of training. But a lot of times as hall coordinators, going into that next point there, we try and make sure that student leaders are connecting those dots. And so a lot of times RHCs will be taking time out of in-hall, usually within 2 to 4 weeks of move-in. That's typically when we start to see some of the environmental factors come into play, particularly if there's things like, as Malik mentioned, having the windows open but running the AC. That's typically when we start to see that build up, start to culminate into something else. So again, that's when we debrief with student leaders in-hall, and then RHCs have the discretion to know what their building is seeing, and then kind of go through that process with their student leaders. But reiterating the process of our campus departments and resources as well. So just kind of briefly going back over the things we covered in student leader training, just to make sure it's fresh. And then also, if needed, we do try to communicate with housing, and then either bring in like Malik or one of our other associate directors in housing to kind of provide some clarity on the process, our response, and how we're addressing these situations. And then in a similar timeline as above, so usually 2 to 4 week period, we also go over with student leaders, making sure that they know how to process service requests correctly, making sure that they're putting them in and categorizing them correctly as well, particularly because if it is a mold concern and they don't categorize it correctly, it may take longer to route it to the appropriate team. So that said, we just make sure that they're also familiar with how to track service requests as well. So that way, if residents ask a question about whether or not something's been addressed, they know how to go into our service, which is Star Res, where we track our maintenance, and then that way they could check to see what the status of that service request is. And with that, I'll pass it back to Malik for our broader education that we have publicly available.
Okay, thank you, Jake. So yes, over the last couple of years, our department has worked on a number of different educational programs for our students to help them understand mold and what may cause mold growth. And so, and also, like we mentioned before, about trying to reduce the fear level that students may have. A lot of times we will get, communication from parents, students, and service requests or emails that say that there's black mold or toxic mold. And mold can be black in color, but that doesn't mean that it is that particular strain of dangerous black mold. We know what that type of mold is. It's called Stachybotrys charturum, if I remember correctly. And so that type of mold it doesn't grow very easily. And it doesn't compete very well with other types of molds. And so that's not something that we see on a regular basis. And so it's really helping, well, not on a regular basis. It's not something we see in our environment. And so it's helpful to explain that to both parents and students. And so we have a mold brochure that we have created for that educational purpose. And we get that out to our students, both in a physical form and via social media. In addition to that, we've also created some instructional videos that for two different reasons. One is to help folks better understand mold. So a lot of the educational components that Paul shared earlier, we expand on that, and we've produced videos that can be found on YouTube that talk about mold, and we do it in 3 different parts for that one, so that we do it in like, I think they're like less than 2-minute videos each, because we also know what best practices are when we're trying to get information out via social media, that you don't want longer videos because folks will lose their attention span. And so in order to maintain that, we did that video in 3 separate parts. And it essentially explains everything that we explain to our student leaders, and we package it in a way that is easy for them to understand. And then in addition to that, one of the things that we found that it's a contributing factor to mold growth, when we talked about relative humidity being a contributor, and then sometimes also just condensation that may occur inside of our air conditioning units, has everything to do with kind of the, I'll say mismanagement, but that sounds so dire, but the mismanagement of their thermostat. So if they're keeping their temperature either too high or too low, or they're not ventilating their space, that can cause that elevation of humidity inside their room. That'll then lead to that mold growth. So we talk about how to properly set their thermostat. And so we try to, educate them to keep their thermostat set between 72 and 68 degrees in order to kind of maintain a proper environment in their room. So we produce these videos. I'm the narrator on the videos, and one of our student graphic designers that created these for us also made an animated version of myself that are present inside the videos. And they're, at least on the West Coast, they're fairly popular. So next slide, Jake. I think there's more on our education. Oh, I think you started the videos. There we go. All right. So other things that we do to kind of help educate parents and families as well is, I talked about some of the things that we do earlier, but we can arrange joint calls between our office, environmental health and safety, and parents and family upon request. So a lot of times we do get, inquiries from parents that, claim to be experts on mold and have a strong understanding of what mold is and how it's caused. But then sometimes their requests don't match that understanding. And so it's important for us to be able to meet with them, hear their concerns, provide some of that more direct education, and again, telling them what we can and cannot do. And so we have coordinated meetings between myself and Paul to communicate with parents. It's important to listen to their concerns and give them that opportunity to voice what their concerns are. And so we do listen, and then, try to do what we can to support what their concerns are. Even to the point where we've done air sampling for them. We've worked with parents and who have gone to doctors and gotten mycotoxin screenings for their students, where it does show that they have, a level of mycotoxins in their system. And so we try to help them figure out how to mitigate that or to change that. There was one situation I'll give as an example where the student, was reporting from their doctor that they had mycotoxins in their system. When we did a full air assessment in that student's room, we found that there was and the room was immaculate. They had taken very good care of it. They were following all of our instructions on the management of their air conditioning. And yet, we didn't find any mold in the room. And so we communicated that report back to the parent so that the parent could take that to their doctor and show that, there may be some other concerns or other ways that student may be getting mycotoxins. We go through the mold assessment process and talk about everything that we do so that we can explain those protocols. It's important that we do, follow our set protocols so that they understand that and know what it is that we're doing. And so when we discuss those next steps with them, it's really about, did we assess the room with environmental health and safety, and what did we find? Can we do air and surface sampling? And so again, in some circumstances where, the students are reporting, again, those health impacts, and we're not able to determine, what may be causing the mold growth in their room or that illness, we will do some of that air or surface sampling to give them that information that they can then take to their doctor. And then we can talk about what the remediation and cleanup process is with them. And then we can discuss also, again, like I mentioned before, about relocating students. So we discuss all of those options with them, and it helps them understand that we're in this to support their student and not trying to cover anything up. And so, as Paul mentioned earlier about being fully transparent, I think our approach to how we work with parents and families also reinforces that transparency in following up with action. And I think they appreciate that. Right. All right. And then I know for our communication management, with there being a lot of moving parts to our process, we do have some support staff in our office that do track in our service request system anything that reflects if the word mold or mushroom or fungus or whatever pops up in any of our service requests. We do have staff that are tracking that and doing the appropriate follow-up. And so we do keep a service log of all of our mold situations, and all of our documentation and reports from EH&S are managed through that process. And this also helps us with our follow-up communication with parents and students, is that we do have standardized template emails that do go out, and that we have support staff that help us with that. Next slide. All right, Paul, is this back to you?
This is back to me. Thanks, Malik. Yeah. All right. So as we spoke about or mentioned a few times, so open and honest and transparent communication is always the goal throughout this whole process. One way that we do that is by providing a comprehensive report at the end of the assessment. So when we go to a room to assess for mold, we typically are there with either someone from our Office of Housing Administration and or someone from Housing Facilities. So immediately after the assessment, we relay the findings to that representation on that side of campus. And if the student is present, we communicate that as well. So just so that we can get the ball rolling and that they can start preparing to address whatever needs to be, cleaning of the HVAC or replacing the air filter, whatever the case may be. But on the back end, we create a comprehensive report that we also provide to the student and the parent, and they can share that with their healthcare provider as they wish. So the report, so in my past life, I was a consultant, so I did do multiple mold inspections for residential and commercial properties, and I basically took the same format and kind of recreated it for campus and included those same key points. So that's kind of the format that you'll see here. Our report typically starts out with the background. So why were we notified, what the service request was related to, meaning, spotting observed on a HVAC register, or was there a water damage situation that the student is concerned about? We also like to include dates. So that's very key too. Sometimes someone mentions that maybe they've been telling someone for weeks and nobody's come out, but our records indicate that, a service request was not received until, 2 days before we got there. So we do indicate what dates we were notified and the date that we assessed the space, who was there. Myself and my assistant, we are both certified mold inspectors. There are, training and certification programs available that you can kind of go through just to have a certification available. So we include that as well, just so the parent and student understand that it was somebody that's trained in mold inspection that visited the space. All right. Next, the findings section of the report. So that's basically the meat and potatoes, right? That's the good stuff. So the visual conditions of the room. So we always document the conditions. If there was any spotting, where was it? The dimensions of it. Typically on social media or chat rooms, sometimes you'll see a photo that's shared and it looks like there's mold covering half of a wall in a room. And then when you get to the room, it's about the size of a nickel. So we document that as well within the report too. So temperature and humidity, that is something that we also document within the report. Condition of the room, housekeeping, like I mentioned. Moisture testing, so that's a big one. If there are any signs of water damage or water intrusion, so we do have the ability to check with a moisture meter or an infrared camera. That is also a great way to check spaces that you cannot easily see. For example, like in a drop ceiling or inside of a wall space, a wall cavity. Sometimes people or students have, maybe a misconception that there might be mold growing in a wall. So if you check and there is no moisture, right, theoretically, there should not be any mold growth. There might be just general background spores, yes, but as far as mold growth, that should not be the case if a surface is dry. Condition of the HVAC. So this is a big one, as Malik has talked about too. So the HVAC, a lot of the service requests that we get regarding mold are typically because the student starts to see kind of spotting on a register. Sometimes it's just dust, or most times it is just dust, could be rust. And sometimes there may be enough condensation and dust so that mold spotting has started. So we definitely check the HVAC system within the space. And then with someone from housing facilities there, it's also great because they can open up the fan unit for us, or the fan housing. We take a look in there, and it's also a great opportunity for the student, if they're there, to see for themselves. So, we shine a flashlight up there, and like Malik said, your fan is just servicing your room. There's nothing connected to the rest of the building. You can take a look for yourself. You're probably going to see a little bit of dust up there. That's on us, our homework to follow up on. We'll come through, we'll clean it. If the filter needs to be replaced, that's again on us. That's our homework to follow up on. And we found also a good way to check, like Malik had mentioned, if they might be running the HVAC with the window open. So our housing facilities team, they're great. They put a date. They put the exact date that filter was replaced. And these filters are meant to last typically, anywhere from 6 months to a year. So there have been many cases where we go into a space, we see the filter, it's caked and loaded with dust, dirt, debris. And it's only been a month since the filter was replaced. So that's kind of a good indication that they might be running the HVAC with the window open. We don't, we're not pointing fingers, we're not assigning blame, but that is a great way to tell if maybe some reinforcement of education is needed. So we, communicate that with the students too. And again, like Jake was saying, empathy, we tell them, we understand your concern. We're here to help, and also talk about ways to minimize bringing in spores and humidity into a living space. All right, let's see, other possible factors. So we do include other possible factors in the report as well. So, essential oil diffusers, like I said, those things can shoot the humidity up to like 90%. We have found that in many places, so that's a big no-no that we try to avoid. Plants as well. I love it when I go into a room or a living space and I see that the student has plants and, they've made it feel like home and they took some pride. But unfortunately, if they have any concerns to mold and reactions to any kind of mold spores, they might want to switch to artificial plants, right? If they want some plants instead of live plants in soil. If we did collect any samples, we include that as well in the report. And you'll see it in a few slides from now, but the actual report from the laboratory, it's pretty hard to understand what they're saying unless you do it on a daily basis or you work with a professional to kind of interpret those lab results. So we like to pull that data and just put it in a simple table, and that's what you're looking at right here. So like we talked about, mold spores are present everywhere. So I really simplify it in this table. You'll see, what was the spore level indoors? What was the spore level outdoors, which is the background? And is the indoor level lower than the outdoor level, right? Because that's the main thing, is we're just trying to minimize the amount of spores within the space. Not really going to get to zero, but we're trying to reduce it as much as possible. Next slide, please, Jake. All right, the summary. So we include, like I said, if there was any spotting, where was it located, the size of the spotting. We include that in the report. Possible causes. So whether, like I mentioned, humidity and dust. So is it housekeeping? Is it possibly, maybe running the HVAC with the window open? Is it condensation on the window, a water leak? So we include what we determine might be the cause of what is causing the spotting. The biggest thing is health. So I know that the parents, that's their main focus. Obviously, we understand the concern, and like Jake was saying, we always want to be empathetic and understand why they are feeling that way if they do see any spotting. But we are not healthcare professionals, so we include that in the report as well. We do advise the students and the parents to consult with a medical professional if they believe that mold is causing their symptoms. So, and it's, a piece of the puzzle. So open and honest communication. We tell the parents and students, here's the report, take it with you to your provider. Maybe they can, see if it is related. If not, they can do, allergy screens, panels, whatever they might need to do. And kind of going back to what Malik mentioned about the mycotoxins. So this is something we're kind of hearing a little bit more about lately, are mycotoxin panels and screens. A part of the education part too, and some medical professionals do communicate that. Some, I'm getting the sense, are not communicating that, is that mycotoxins are commonly present in food and grains, wheat, rice, beans, coffee. So I saw a study recently, up to 25% of those commodities can have mycotoxins. So that is, like I said, we just hope that the medical provider is relaying that information and having that communication with the student. So recommendations, we always want to include recommendations in our report. We don't just want to point out problems, we also want to try to provide solutions. So whether it's cleaning, housekeeping, and like I said, it could be homework on our end, could be homework on the student's end, maybe the filter needs to be replaced, maybe we need to check out the HVAC unit, but we summarize that in the report. And then photo log. So we take, and I recommend taking, if you're doing the assessment yourself in-house, or if you're using a consultant, definitely stress taking a lot of photos. So what's the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words? And that's definitely the case when it comes to mold assessments. So lab results. So we do include the lab results, even though, like I mentioned, when it comes directly from the laboratory, and you'll see an example of it, it's not that easy to read, but we include that. We like to show the parent that we're being open and honest in our communication. The samples, if we did collect them, we did not take them to a professor here on campus to, analyze it themselves, even though they probably could. But we take it to a non-biased, a third-party, nationally accredited laboratory in San Diego, and they do the analysis, give us the results, and we include it in the report so the parents can see and students can see for themselves. And the mold handout fact sheet. So Jake talked about that a little bit earlier, just another tool for communication and educating the parents and the students about minimizing mold within the space. Sometimes it's hard to have that conversation with the parent and the student at the beginning or when they submit the service requests. Oftentimes at that stage, they're agitated or highly elevated, I guess you could say. But later on, when we give them the report and they see that we've done all these things, we've done all these steps, multiple people have jumped on this, followed up on their concern, including that in the report, I think is a great way for them to, when they finally have time to kind of sit down, think it through, look it over, to see some of these things that we just talked about, right? So spores are everywhere, how to minimize spores, how to minimize humidity, some things that are within their control if they do have mold concerns. And then the last thing that we include, if there was any spotting observed, we include the mold remediation protocol. So we have procedure set up in place, and it's essentially the same cleaning practice equipment that would be used if you were to hire a professional remediation company to come to campus. So our housing facility staff and housing custodial staff, a few of them have gone through a training program here in San Diego. So, and you might be able to find the training provider in your area if this is something that you might want to consider doing yourself in-house. And we limit it to small areas, small cleanups, but if it is a larger cleanup, we would of course recommend that maybe a remediation company needs to come in. For example, if there's a significant leak on the 3rd floor and it impacted a bunch of rooms from the 3rd floor all the way down to the 1st floor. But we like to include that to show the parent and the student that we did follow the proper procedures and address their concerns as best as we can. All right, next slide. And so, like I mentioned, picture is worth 1,000 words. So we like to document the condition of the room. If we did any infrared camera imaging, we include that in the report as well. Humidity readings, and another big one that we started adding within the last year or two, I think that's been very helpful, is also taking a photo of the HVAC thermostat. So we have had situations where you walk in the room and it's like a meat locker, right? They have it set at like 45 degrees. And here in San Diego, when it's 85 degrees outside, not the best idea. You will start to see condensation on the window. We have also had situations where, like I mentioned, one room set their thermostat very low, the other room was normal, and we did observe condensation along the wall in between those rooms. So, and then the last photo here is basically the lab report from the laboratory when we have done air sampling. So as you can see, not easy to read, a bunch of numbers and, units of measurement and things like that. So, but I will gladly go over, Malik and I will gladly go over the report with the parents when we do have that communication, if they do want to chat with us after. All right, and I'll turn it back over to Malik.
Thank you, Paul. So I would, for this next slide, just to give you some sense of our protocols and some recommendations for each of your campuses, is establish a set of protocols for your response to mold spotting. So similar to ours, it's important to have it from start to finish, again, and including a communication plan, your remediation plan, and how you're going to approach that. And it's important through all of that to be consistent in how you are following those protocols. Following your guidance, if you do have a relationship, I think we are lucky at San Diego State to have a very open and solid working relationship with our environmental health and safety partners. And so following that guidance is important so that we are, again, consistent with how we're approaching mold spotting in our community. And then provide tasks for both your custodial and maintenance staff. So it's not your staff doesn't feel like they're being the ones that are burdened with mold. It's important also to educate your custodial and maintenance staff. Some folks may have phobias or concerns about approaching mold situations. And so important to, again, provide that training and to certify your staff on mold remediation. And so we've done that in having both staff on our custodial team and on our maintenance team have been provided that training. Make sure that you're also giving them the necessary, PPE as well. And so that their health is not impacted. One of the things important is, again, cleaning and disinfecting all surfaces. Provide some financial support. So one of the things that we can do is if our students have some of their personal belongings that need to be cleaned, and we instruct them to use our laundry facilities, we can provide some financial support for students with their personal belongings. And then if the mold damage is so extensive in a space, we do have a insurance partner for our students to have their renter's insurance. And so we also will walk them through that process in order to file those claims as well. And then it's important to correct any maintenance related deficiencies that may be contributing factors. And so that is, a very real reason. We have had issues with our air conditioning units sometimes that are, with condensation leaks. And so it's important for us to correct those issues in a timely fashion. All right. And then I think Cynthia has the last slide.
I do. Thanks,
There you go.
Malik. We've highlighted how a robust program can play a pivotal role in enhancing an existing process or even establishing a new one to effectively mitigate mold-related issues. We do this through a structured approach that involves the following key steps, and ones that you can also follow to enhance your existing program or serve as a roadmap of where to begin. So it is a shared responsibility. Mitigating mold is a shared responsibility that involves collaboration among housing administration, residential education, environmental health and safety, and our students. By working together, we can address mold issues comprehensively. Communication, open and transparent communication is the cornerstone of our strategy. It ensures that mold-related concerns are reported promptly and accurately, allowing a swift response and resolution. Established procedures. We've established clear procedures that guide our response to mold incidents. These procedures help streamline the mitigation process and ensure consistency in our approach. We also have after actions. Every year or more often as needed, we conduct thorough after action reviews of our responses. This step allows us to identify areas of improvement and make necessary adjustments to our procedures and practices. Process improvement, continuous improvement is essential in our mold mitigation efforts. We certainly, we didn't get here overnight. So we've committed to learning from each experience and continuing to refine our process. And by emphasizing shared responsibility, effective communication, well-established procedures, after action reviews, and a commitment to continuous improvement, we strengthen our ability to mitigate mold-related challenges and provide a comfortable living environment for our students. So I do see that we've had some questions in the chat, and I do want to start with addressing one question that asked, how do you emphasize with facilities the need for preventative maintenance? And I appreciate this question because, again, each institution is a little bit different. The departments may sit in different areas and not maybe all under housing. I think the first step is expectation, knowing what is the expectation for preventative maintenance. Has anything been established? In most cases, there are, and it starts with understanding what the preventative maintenance plan is, and then understanding if there are sufficient resources to support it. Because oftentimes what I come across as I work with colleagues at other institutions is that there are expectations and standards. However, there might be some recent challenges with staffing concerns where they're not staffed enough to meet the regular schedule. So perhaps the schedule shifted a little bit to accommodate for the lack of resources. And I would say that the last thing is a great way to start that partnership, and some of where all of this started, actually our first step was to create a standard operating procedure. So we just came to the table and we documented how things were at that moment, how we approached it. It wasn't about creating and developing at that point. It was just understanding how we were approaching these requests, what communication existed, what is our preventative maintenance program. And then it started from there to analyze, where can we fine tune and start building efficiencies. So like I said, we didn't get here overnight. This is a process that's taken several years to get to where we are today. And it's not perfect. We continue to fine tune and add and then adjust to our students and their families. Things change rapidly. So does the environment as we're learning. Our challenges sometimes can be very seasonal. We definitely, now that we're tracking data on a more regular basis, which has been really helpful, we know and expect when we start to see these challenges, usually 3 weeks after move-in. And it's usually our most humid time in San Diego. And then things tend to drop off as we head into fall and winter. So again, the data is going to help inform a lot of your process and can even drive some of the discussion on process improvement. Any other questions? All right.
As long as we can get this presentation, I think that might be the only question.
Yes, absolutely. So I will go ahead and work with the Hawaii to send out a copy of our presentation. I'm also going to drop in our emails in the chat because I realize they're not on this last slide. So if you have any follow-up questions, if you ever find a need to, you're starting this process and you want us to, come chat, we can hop on a Zoom, walk through our workflow, just so folks at your institution can also benefit from hearing about our process and take away what might work for you all. So a question, what drove our need to develop this process? So, over the years, we started to see an increase in requests, and they were one-off before. So that was easy for us to manage. If you have one incident, it's the volume just rose exponentially as we also grew. So we 10 years ago were right about 3,000 beds, and now at 8,400. We just saw that more requests were coming in, and we realized we needed to be a little bit more streamlined and efficient to manage that volume. So that's really what kicked it off and has led us to where we are now. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Do you guys have, for lack of better terms, I would say redacted, but do you guys have a anonymous report that you can share, at least the formatting, right? How you guys' report looked for some of the universities that may not have such a robust process as you guys.
Yeah, a template. Certainly we can, Paul, I'll let Paul speak to that. It is something that he's really worked on and see how we can create a template for others.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Not a problem. I can send you a report and we can remove any personal data or, identifying information. Absolutely. My email address is in the chat, so feel free to contact me directly. And I can if you wouldn't mind, maybe give me a week just to kind of clean up one of our reports, and then I'll send that out.
Happy to help. Right. Any last questions, comments?
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you for this presentation. It was really, really great. I work with Brittany, and I believe she has a question in the chat. But is there a threshold on how when you engage in this process? Is it whenever a student reports of mold, or is there a higher threshold before you start this?
Yes, that's an excellent clarifying question. So when we first started this process, we treated every report the same. And then we quickly learned that not every report required the level of response that we were providing. So a part of our workflow is assessing that initial service request. We have a team member call the student to gauge what they're seeing, what prompted them to submit the report. Because sometimes the information we receive in our service request system can be very minimal. It'll just say, I think I have mold in my vents, and that's it. So that phone call is a follow-up to understand a little bit more, and then trigger whether we send somebody from our facilities team to go inspect and address, or if potentially we are suspecting they may have some growth, which would trigger more of an environmental health and safety inspection, which is a more comprehensive assessment. Now, if our facilities team member walks into that space and says, oh, this one is going to need more of an assessment, then we also get that feedback and trigger the process. But great question. So not every submission will require the same level of response from a facilities aspect, but from a communication perspective, we respond very similarly in our front communication to the student, and then when we close out the service request. So we're always going to provide that education, what we did, what we found. If environmental health and safety does do an inspection, then that report becomes a little bit lengthier, and that just is another complement to the communication we're providing the student.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that might be it. So we'll work on sending out a copy of the presentation. And again, feel free to reach out anytime. We're happy to help in any way we can. And thank you so much for your time and joining us today.
I just want to share a quick thank you to our presenters, Cynthia, Paul, Jake, and Malik. This has been a great conversation, so thank you for sharing. And thanks to those participating and asking such great questions throughout the session. As we said, this will be recorded and available soon, and I will connect with our presenters to get those other resources sent out to folks that registered to attend. In the chat, I have just put our upcoming webinars and things, so if you enjoyed today, many more good topics coming next week. And thank you all.
Thank you so much.